All right, everybody, welcome back. Today, we are going to tackle cumulative impacts assessments. We're going to talk about some externalities. This is just, we're talking about fancy ways of talking about how we're going to conceptualize, characterize, measure the impacts of environmental justice, right? So we're getting kind of into this more kind of technical side and putting some shape to these impacts, right? So again, I know these sound like some dry technical terms, but stick with me because this lecture is really going to fundamentally change a lot of our understanding of environmental decision making. It's quite important. And by the end of today, my goal is for you to understand why, when we look at projects and we look at projects and their impacts one at a time, this misses the whole picture, right? How cost gets transferred from, let's say, corporations to communities, and why regulatory systems consistently fail to protect the most vulnerable people. Okay. So, one of the most impactful, serious examples that a lot of us can connect to in terms of differential impacts is Hurricane Katrina, right? This is one of the most horrific environmental justice disasters that many of us can recall in our lifetime. And maybe you don't think of it as an environmental justice disaster, right? And the clearest, visibility of this is how seriously communities of color in the Fifth Ward were just deeply more seriously impacted by the hurricane. So many lives lost, so much property destruction, so long for these communities to recover, and still, seeing those impacts, feeling those generational impacts, long-term impacts today, right, from this hurricane. Whereas white communities in New Orleans in Louisiana recovered much faster and experienced very few impacts in the long run, right? So I'll share some video of that goes into this a bit deeper for this week to think about this, but I want to sort of set the tone and get you to sort of think about the framing that we're discussing, and Hurricane Katrina is just the best example. There's so many incredible documentaries that have gone into just how serious this was and how much the media and maybe our understanding as a whole has missed about this time in America. And what we're thinking about, right, is beyond just exposure. We're thinking about differential vulnerability. So exposure is not the same as impact, right? So the same environmental hazard can produce really different outcomes based on pre-existing health status, social infrastructure in the community, right? Healthcare access, social networks, economic resources, right? Money, insurance coverage, time, and also legal and political power, right? If you're living in a marginalized community, this can be much harder to demand cleanup enforcement. But also there's been some really interesting work that has looked at how this impact can vary based on where you live, right? Where you're born, what your ancestors, your parents, your grandparents experienced, right? These impacts go deep and it goes a lot farther than just the immediate exposure to harm. So imagine this, right? A cement factory opens, or a plantation expands into surrounding land. A new highway, as we talked about, cuts through a neighborhood. A coal plant begins operation. Which impact matters most? And here's the thing, this is a trick question, right? It's actually the wrong way to think about the problem entirely, right? See, the impact assessment, and again, now we're going back to impact, okay? So we were talking a little bit about exposure. We're going to go a bit more into exposure, but now I'm moving into impact, okay? I just want to make that clear. Impact assessment typically asks, what harm does this specific project cause, right? And they're going to look at this one project at a time or one impact at a time. But communities don't experience life project to project or impact to impact, right? They experience everything simultaneously, this exposure idea, right? The factory and the plantation and the highway and the power plant, right? All these at once every single day. And this gap in how we assess impacts and how people actually experience environmental injustice, that's really what we're exploring today. And that really takes us to this environmental justice informed impact assessment, okay? So when we contrast between the assessment question and human reality, right, we have to make this really clear. Impact assessment asks, right, what harms does this project cause? it's singular, isolated. But communities experience, as we said, what harm does everything cause? This is this idea of cumulative, right? This building on top, overlapping, interacting. It's not just semantics, right? This difference shapes whose voices get heard, which impacts get counted, and ultimately who gets protected and who gets sacrificed, right? There's this really, really awful term called sacrifice zones, where some communities are seen of as, well, they're just going to have to bear the costs of this, the impacts of this, for the good of a larger project, or the good of industry, or the good of making money. It's quite awful. And so keep this tension in mind as we move through today's lecture, right? We're going to build up conceptual tools to understand why this happens and what we can do about it, right? So externalities are defined externally, right? An externality is a cost or benefit from an economic activity that's going to affect third parties who did not choose to incur that cost or benefit, right? So let me break that down. Like when a factory produces something, there are internal costs: raw materials, labor, energy. The company pays these. But there are also external costs: air pollution that causes respiratory illnesses in nearby residents, water contamination that will kill fish downstream and pollute the water table, noise pollution that disrupts sleep and well being. And the company doesn't pay for these, right? Someone else does. And look at that equation, right? The price paid does not equal the true social cost. This is really important. The market price of goods reflects the inner costs of the producer, right? But it externalizes environmental and health costs onto communities and ecosystems that are often living in these so-called sacrifice zones. Again, this is economics 101 kind of bridging here with environmental justice, right? And once you see this, you really can't unsee it. It's everywhere. And it's really important to think about this when we're doing environmental justice analysis, okay? So again, these are some acute exposure events, right? Industrial accidents. We can think of Bhopal accident, Texas City refinery explosion, chemical spills, sudden environmental disasters, measurable, visible, time bound. That's what these acute exposure events, right? We see the immediate disaster. But what's more insidious in slow violence is a chronic exposure, right? Daily air pollution from highways, right? That may be impacting generations of community, of people over time. Lead in the water infrastructure, pesticide drift, right? These are often invisible. They're often normalized, right? They're just something we have to deal with, and they're ongoing, right? Remember Rob Nixon's example of slow violence. And externalities can come in two flavors, right? So let's look at both. Negative externalities, we can think of pollution from manufacturing, noise from airports, health costs from industrial emissions that your tax dollars cover through public health care, ecosystem degradation from agriculture that reduces biodiversity, degrades soil, contaminates water. But and I should note, urban EJ impacts and exposure, right? These negative externalities tend to be concentrated in urban settings, okay? Because people are denser together. There's more history here. There can be more heavy industry, a lot of different racial and targeted environmental racism that's gone over for decades that are putting marginalized communities near these factories. So a lot of negative externalities are concentrated in urban settings, but that's not the full story. But I just want you to think about that. And we're going to talk about that a little bit at the end in terms of the difference between urban and different other systems, right? Positive externalities do exist too. This is when someone might restore a wetland, right? Everyone downstream is going to get cleaner water. They might plant trees in a city to reduce temperature in a heat island, increasing biodiversity, right? Both types affect people. That's the key, right? And these people are not part of the original transaction, the business deal, the project. They're not really getting to choose whether to bear those costs or receive those benefits. And many times they're completely left out of the conversation. And this is, where it gets interesting from an EJ perspective, right? Companies' goal is always going to be, for the most part, to maximize profits by minimizing their internal costs, right? That's not evil. That's not even unusual, right? That's capitalism working exactly as it was designed. But externalities represent costs that gets transferred. The communities who are living near facilities to ecosystems that absorb pollution, to future generations who inherit contaminated land, to the state through public health expenditures and environmental cleanup, right? All these are being transferred into those who bear the cost, right? And who bears the cost is the key thrust of the justice question, right? And this pattern is quite clear, as we've talked about throughout the semester and in your readings, right? Costs get externalized onto those more often than not with the least power to refuse them or fight them, right? Look at how this works, right? The company will calculate the internal costs minus profit equals price, right? But the true cost includes all those externalized impacts. Communities pay the difference, right? This is not abstract. And these cumulative impacts, they compound on each other to make things even worse, right? A cumulative impact is the impact on the environment resulting from the incremental impact of an action when added to other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future actions, right? So let me translate that. It's not one thing. Again, it's everything. The word cumulative is crucial, right? It means that these impacts build up over time. They add together, they interact, they compound. Your body can handle one stressor pretty well, right? For the most part, if you're healthy, able adult, you're not experiencing anything that would impact your immune system, right? You can handle stress pretty well, but you can compensate. But what about multiple simultaneous stressors, right? That's when systems start breaking down. It's the same with communities, same with ecosystems. A community might handle one factory's emissions, right? But three factories plus agricultural runoff plus a highway plus loss of forest buffers plus increased flooding, that's where we start to see cumulative impact. And these marginalized communities, these communities experiencing severe environmental justice, this is a daily reality, right? Acceptable individual impacts become collectively unlivable, right? And acceptable is a loaded term for sure. So why does this matter, right? Well, contract between that individual assessment that we talked about and really the cumulative reality of most communities, right, is that individual project assessments ask again, is this project acceptable, right? And regulators are going to evaluate one proposal at a time in many cases, right? But in reality, that doesn't really function. Communities, again, are facing multiple simultaneous stressors: air pollution from three different factories, water contamination, noise, loss of forest buffers, increased flooding. Each one might pass an individual assessment, right? Each one might be technically acceptable according to a data source or regulatory standards, but combined, this becomes unlivable in many situations. This is why communities and researchers often talk past the regulators, right? Regulators are seeing individual acceptable projects. Communities are seeing and experiencing these cumulative unacceptable conditions, and this assessment framework shapes what gets seen and what gets ignored, right? This is also why climate change is so devastating, because climate change is the mother of all cumulative impacts, right? And so three equations really show kind of how this breaks down, right? I am going to complicate this a bit further, so stay with me, right? Cumulative impacts are not simply additive, though. Okay, look at these three models. Additive, 1 plus 1 equals 3, right? You might assume that's how impacts work, right? You just add them up. But impacts can be synergistic. They operate within systems. 1 plus 1 equals 5, right? The impacts interact, they amplify each other. Chemical A plus chemical B together might be far more toxic than adding their individual toxicities would predict. Heat stress plus air pollution equals exponentially higher mortality than either stressor alone. Antagonistic, right, is where we see this as 1 plus 1 equals 2, right? Sometimes one stressor partially mitigates another, and this is a feedback loop, right? This can be an enhancing or minimizing feedback loop, and this complexity matters enormously for assessment. You can't just add up individual project impacts, right? You have to see how these interact, and we're often really terrible at predicting those interactions. And it's hard. It's really difficult to predict this, right? None of us have a crystal ball. And some of these things are unknown, right? And especially decades ago, a lot of things were unknown, or so they told us they were. And cumulative impacts, they operate across time and space in ways that really mess with our normal regulatory frameworks, right? So Temporally, with time, you're dealing with the past, right? Legacy contamination from 50 years ago that's still in the soil and groundwater. And then in the present, with current operations happening right now, in the future, with approved projects that haven't even broken ground yet, how far back do you look, right? How far forward? Those choices are really going to shape what counts as cumulative. And spatially, in terms of maps and distance, there's almost always a mismatch between the project boundary and the actual impact zone. Air pollution doesn't stop at a made up boundary, a fence line, a road, right? Water flows downstream and continues. Wildlife migration corridors cross multiple properties. Ecosystems, environmental systems, nature doesn't recognize the boundaries that humans place on them, right? So when someone tells you, oh, this project only affects 50 acres, they might be measuring the wrong thing, right? They're measuring the project footprint, not the impact footprint, right? And those are rarely the same. I'm going to give you an example from Cancer Alley, but a really good in action is Sharon Levine, who founded Rise St. James. She won the Goldman Prize in 2021. She stopped Formosa Plastics' $9.4 billion factory. But in her community, they have all these factories and refineries that are put here. And this is environmental racism in action, right? She says they put us here because we're black and poor. They think we don't matter. This is environmental racism. It's not accident. It's not externalities. It's targeting, right? And in some cases, we have to look deeper, look further in environmental justice analysis, right? The companies may claim it's just externalities, right? We couldn't have predicted this. But our analysis, our research seeks to push back on that, right? And seeks to support communities in claiming, well, it may not be as cut and dry as you're making it seem, right? Push back on that red tape, push back on those frameworks. And statistics, so here's where we connect this back to environmental justice, right? Who's bearing these cumulative impacts, right? Again, it's not random. There's a clear global pattern. Facilities cluster in low-income neighborhoods where land is cheaper. And I mean, look at these numbers, right? In Los Angeles, communities in the top 10% of pollution burden have median household incomes of $37,000 or lower than those in the bottom 10%, right? This pattern, it repeats everywhere, right? Because the same factors that make people vulnerable to one environmental burden make them vulnerable to accumulating more. Low property values attract polluting facilities. Lack of political power means less effective opposition, less legal fees for community for companies, less legal red tape. Existing degradation make the area seem like it's already a sacrifice zone, right? Which just put the factory here. Look what's already happened, right? Cumulative impacts, they don't distribute randomly. They concentrate in specific communities, and that concentration is deeply, deeply patterned by race, class, and power. The data shows it. Robert Bullard, really forefront of this, as we talked about. It's not accidental, okay? So how do you actually assess cumulative impacts, right? Let's talk about the barriers. Challenge number one is data. To properly assess cumulative impacts, you need a lot. You need complete facility inventories showing every pollution source, emissions data across multiple pollutants, historical contamination records, health surveillance data that's spatially specific enough to show neighborhood level patterns, demographic data at fine spatial scales. In practice, these data gaps are everywhere. The data might not exist. You might not be able to get access to it. The facility might not want to share it with you, right? This is tough. The absence of data, though, is not neutral. No data means no assessment. No assessments mean no documentation of cumulative burden. No documentation means no basis for justice claims. Communities often know cumulative impacts through lived experience, but they lack the data to make that knowledge legible to these entrenched and rigid regulatory systems, right? Again, this is where you come in. So, again, it's also difficult because boundaries matter, right? Where do you draw the line, right? Look at these questions, right? Geographically, do you use the airshed, the watershed? This might be scientifically appropriate, but the administrative boundaries like districts don't match the environmental systems, right? Or do you let the communities define their own boundaries based on their lived experience and social networks, right? But how far back do you look? Just recent history or legacy contamination from decades ago, right? How far forward? Only approved project or everything is likely given development trajectories, right? Do you look at just industry or also agriculture, transportation, household sources of pollution, right? Every single one of these choices is going to shape the outcome. So when you're designing your research study, you have to think carefully about this, right? If you make the boundary too small, you miss the cumulative impacts potentially, right? Make it too large, you might dilute. And someone has to decide, right? Who gets to make these choices matters enormously for how these impacts get counted. So there's a few different assessment approaches you can use to kind of get to this, right? And you're going to encounter these in the literature. I would love to see you use these in your research proposal, but these are things that can help you, fight through the muddy waters, right? So overlay and index methods, this is very common, right? So you map multiple stressors, you're going to assign weights to different factors, and you're going to create cumulative burden scores, okay? We're going to talk about California's Cal Enviro screen and the EPA EJ screen, but these are great examples of how this is used in action. And these screening tools are great because they're immense sources of data that can be constantly updated and refined. And they can really help identify these hotspots quickly, right? You can overlay different aspects to really kind of sort through all these different factors that we talked about, right? They're good for prioritization, but they might simplify complex interactions, right? So risk assessment is another approach, right? These are going to identify those exposure pathways, right? They're going to consider more exposure rather than just impacts, okay? They're going to establish maybe dose response relationships from pollutants, right? How much are people being exposed? And what is that relationship in terms of how health outcomes are being experienced, right? They might estimate population exposure and characterize health risks in really great ways, right? But more technically complex and data intensive, this can provide quantitative health impact estimates that some regulators might take seriously again, but you might get too fine-grained and miss some of these broader impacts, okay? Community-based assessment, this is participatory mapping, where residents can identify sources of concern themselves, right? You could do community health surveys. You could do photo voice projects where people will document impacts through photography. This is really cool. You can integrate traditional ecological knowledge, right? This approach will center that community expertise about what cumulative life actually feels like, right? This data looks different, but it captures things that these technical models might miss, okay? Modeling approaches then are going to be, examples like air dispersion models, water quality models, exposure models, cumulative risk frameworks that try to account for multiple pathways and multiple stressors simultaneously, right? These are often sophisticated, but they require a lot of data and computational resources and also skills and expertise, right? Each method has strengths and limitations, okay? Technical models, they provide quantitative estimates but require data that often doesn't exist and can miss the impacts that communities prioritize in their own words. Community-based methods are going to center the lived experience, but they might produce data that regulators often dismiss as anecdotal. The best cumulative assessments are going to combine multiple approaches, okay? They're going to use screening tools to identify hotspots. They're going to use models where you have good data, use the data you have. They're going to use community-based methods to capture what models miss and to really capture those lived experiences and involve communities deeply in the research. And then they're going to triangulate, as we talked about, across the methods, right? No single method is sufficient. And the question really is, how do you integrate them, right? So let me show you an example from Cal Enviro Screen, right? So Cal Enviro Screen, it's become influential globally and really demonstrates several principles we discussed. So, right, so California developed this cumulative impact screening tool, and other jurisdictions are now adapting it. So the way this works is it's a map, right? And you can use this map to change for different indicators that you want to look at, right? So here we've got an example of using overall percentile of of population, I think is what they're measuring here. This is like a pollution burden percentile. Let me see if I can pull it up to use it. Okay, there's like a video tutorial. And I'll link this so you can kind of play with it around or play around with it as well, right? So, I mean, really clear dashboard. You've got 50 average pollution burden percentile. You can zoom in here in this nice GIS interface. You can select specific cities, districts. You can go into like measuring different diesel PM percentile, PM 2.5 percentile. You can kind of change it based on how you want to look at that. You can change it how you want to, look at who's impacted most or least, right? Let's look at the highest PM 2.5 percentile exposure areas. Okay. So this says that 1,125 census tracts are selected, average population characteristics percentile. Oh, cool. So these in these areas where we have this high PM 2.5, you can see that we've got the higher levels of cleanup sites, higher levels of asthma, lower birth weights, and predominantly Latino communities. But again, you do have a strong representation of white communities. Let's narrow this down to the highest. So Latino population increases. You've got higher concentrations of ozone. Drinking water contamination is combined with this, right? So very cool tool that you can use. Other states are looking to adapt this. And 50% of the scores come from pollution data, right? Air quality, drinking water, toxic releases, traffic density. These are exposure indicators, right? The other 50% comes from population characteristics, asthma rates, low birth weights, as we can see. These are the vulnerability indicators, right? Every census tract in California gets a score from 1 to 100. Communities with the top scores become priorities for enforcement, investment, and remediation. And what's crucial here is that Cal EnviroScreen explicitly combines environmental burdens with population vulnerability, right? A high population burden or high pollution burden in a wealthy neighborhood with excellent healthcare access, that will score differently than the same population in a low income area where people lack resources to cope, right? This recognizes that cumulative impacts, they operate different, or they operate through both exposure and susceptibility. Okay. It's not just what you're exposed to, it's whether you have the resources to deal with it. Okay. Health insurance, ability to move, political connections, time to attend hearings, right? This dual structure is why Cal EnviroScreen has become a model for cumulative assessment globally. Okay. There is a broader tool called EJ Screen, which if you take an EMVS 3100, we use quite a bit. But unfortunately, there has been a defunding of this tool. And so at the moment, we can't necessarily trust that the data sources are updated and as accurate as it may have previously been, right? It looks like it's still functioning, and you can still look at some of the environmental burden indicators, socioeconomic indicators, environmental justice indicators. But there has been a few investigations that has shown that this tool may be under threat, and the data may be inaccurate and not being updated in real time as it previously was. So it's unfortunate that we see this. So, let me go back to full screen here. So we went through that. So, we could put this together and talk about justice implications in kind of 4 key ways, right? And standard environmental impact assessments, as we've talked about, right, is this impact significant, right? Usually meaning, does it exceed a regulatory threshold, right? But again, who set that threshold? What data is it being used on, right? If just one metric, I don't know, right? Can we trust it? Cumulative assessment, though, is going to help us, right? It's going to reveal, 4 critical things, right? Who already bears disproportionate burdens before this new project even begins. Okay. Second, whether these new impacts might worsen existing inequity or just maintain it. Okay. Third, we're going to look at how multiple what we deemed insignificant impacts in the one-dimensional assessment might accumulate to crisis, right? And if we deem these as insignificant and don't look at them throughout our evaluation, we might not see this accumulation, right? And fourth, which communities have no margin left, right? Where one more stressor could put conditions past the tipping point. This is why communities and regulators often talk past each other, as I mentioned, right? The regulator is looking at one project and says, hey, this meets standards, let's do it. And the community says, we can't breathe and our kids are sick, the fish are gone, right? What are you talking about, right? Again, both are telling the truth, but they're talking about fundamentally different things, right? The regulatory framework obscures that cumulative reality, making those cumulative impacts visible is an act of justice because it shows what gets systematically ignored, right? What we don't measure remains invisible. This was absolutely the case in Flint, Michigan. This is such a clear case of this, right? Residents were complaining for 18 months, saying their water was contaminated, right? And officials were dismissing this, saying, hey, our regulatory framework shows everything is fine, right? What we're measuring is fine. Virginia Tech researchers came in and they validated that community knowledge, right? They showed that the science confirmed what residents already knew, that their pipes were heavily polluting their water in Flint, Michigan with lead, right? And maybe it wasn't showing up in Detroit, but it was showing up, right? Was this a data gap or strategic ignorance or a far too rigid regulatory framework, right? So I told you I would talk about Cancer Alley again as well. And in Cancer Alley, this is an 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, okay? And over 150 chemical plants and refineries are concentrated in this corridor. I'm going to share a video this week in the resources that you can see some interviews here. So these communities are predominantly Black, and this region has a legacy of plantation geography from slavery and Jim Crow land use planning, okay? So really cut and dry, clear racism over history. And cancer rates in some areas run 50 times the national average, right? 50 times. And the critical point is that each facility was permitted individually, right? There was no cumulative assessment until 2023, right? Until 2023. After decades of community organizing, demanding recognition of cumulative harm. And in St. James Parish, residents face the fourth highest cancer risk from air pollution in the entire US, right? In 2022, as I mentioned, that new plastic plant was defeated, right? But the company initially argued that their facility individually would have acceptable impacts, right? One more insignificant impact added to this burden, this intolerable burden they weren't looking at, right? This is what happens when regulatory systems refuse to look at the cumulative reality, right? Yeah, plastic plant approved because each one technically meets the standards, right? But they're not looking at the cumulative results in this area, right? Again, strategic ignorance or data gap can be both at once. Two things can be true. So the policy landscape is key here, right? Because this is going to explain a lot why cumulative impact assessments doesn't happen more often, okay? Most environmental laws require project by project assessment. That's the default. Cumulative impacts assessment is not legally required in most jurisdictions around the world. There are no standardized methods, so even when it happens, approaches can vary wildly, and it's rarely done proactively before communities are already burdened, right? It often happens after litigation, after impacts are felt. It's often because communities organized and demanded it, not because regulators initiated it, right? That is just so true across the world for industry. So in many places, there's not even a cumulative assessment mandate, as we mentioned, right? The U.S. National Environmental Policy Acts, it mentions cumulative impacts, but it doesn't define how to assess them, right? The European Union has project level EIA requirements, but really weak cumulative provisions. And the policy infrastructure was built for project by project world. It hasn't caught up to cumulative reality. And industry will actively lobby against cumulative impact assessment. That's just the reality because it hurts their bottom line. It hurts their expansion. It hurts the capitalist machine, right? So this is the reality of communities who live among these impacts, right? Smelling every day the disgusting smell of a pig, like a pig butchering or a pig raising factory down the road, or a hazardous waste facility, the sound of an airport nearby your house or a highway running right nearby your home, looking at the giant smokestacks every day you drive your kids to school and knowing that this is impacting you, but not being able to get out of it, right? The chronic stress of knowing that this is taking a toll on your family, this is taking a toll on your health, right? Going to the doctor and being worried every time, right? And the fear of an accident or an explosion or a diagnosis, right? Constantly racking your brain and then leading you into resignation, right? Feeling like you can't do anything about it, no matter how hard you tried. And when you join the meetings, they didn't listen to you. And you've seen this go on for generations. How can we get through this? This is the daily reality for these communities every day, right? And I want you to think about that. I want you to take that into account. This is not abstract. This is real, right? And many of us have never experienced this in our lifetimes, right? We have the privilege of having never to deal with these daily realities on a regular basis. So what would effective cumulative impact assessment require moving forward, right? Well, we can kind of, from the literature and from thinkers on these topics, kind of boil it down to 6 things, right? Legal mandates, making it required, not optional, right? Discretionary assessment means it doesn't happen. where power imbalances are greatest. So we need to make it a mandate. We also need more regional screening tools like the one in California that identify hotspots before new projects even get proposed, right? We can point to the data and say, nope, sorry, this is gonna cascade, this is gonna make problems worse, right? You need to get ahead of the problem instead of responding after the burden accumulates, right? We need more accessible data, public, regularly updated, spatially detailed monitoring and emissions data, modeling that folks can easily access. Sometimes these tools are just too complicated, or as we talked about, sometimes depending on the administration, they can lose funding, right? They shouldn't be tied to the political whims of our reality, right? These are people's lives, right? And we need genuine community participation in defining what impacts matter, right? Not just commenting during commenting periods or, having a say on a draft document, but really shaping the assessment questions and boundaries as co-creators, co-researchers. And we need a precautionary approach when cumulative burden is already high, right? We need to default to no for new projects until we remediate, we reduce the existing burden, right? We need to put more priority and resources into remediation. It doesn't currently exist. And 6, recognition that externalities are fundamentally justice issues. They're not just economic inefficiencies that markets will eventually correct. Markets won't correct them. They never have, right? Markets created them. These requirements, they're both technical and political, which makes them incredibly difficult in our lived reality, right? We have the technical capacity to do this already, right? What's missing is the political will. And when I have here communities aren't passive victims, this is really important to think about, right? And we have to think about this in ethical research, right? How are we defining communities? We need to bring them into the fold as active collaborators, push power towards them, empower them, right? They're not just victims. A few additional thoughts that I want to kind of go over again, right? So disasters, they don't end when the event ends, okay? Pre-existing structural and slow violence conditions, they will create differential outcomes that are often ignored, right? Emotions of communities are data. Effective responses will often reveal injustice that statistics might miss, right? If impacts are differential, responses must be differential, right? And to achieve transformation, again, we must prioritize, remediate, reparate, provide reparations, and push control back to communities, right? So we talked through a few of these, but these are some examples of some different tools you can think about in your research study, right? Ethnography, oral history, things we've talked about. We're going to talk about GIS monitoring ahead. But you can think about some of these additional approaches here. Again, the best practices are mixed methods. And, when analyzing EJ, ask these questions, right? I really want to see this in your research proposals, right? But these are some, again, reminders of some guiding questions, right? Who is differentially vulnerable and why? What are the temporal dimensions? How is harm embodied and experienced by communities, right? What is the urban spatial context, right? Should we be thinking about how place is shaping impact? What is the relationship to climate, right? Is climate a threat multiplier here? How is environmental racism revealing itself specifically here, right? What forms of trauma and memory are present that we need to be aware of? Individual, collective, intergenerational? And what would true justice require, right? Not just mitigation, but transformation. So that's your role in all of this, right? I'm training you to be these researchers, practitioners, advocates who ask these questions, right? When you conduct impact assessments, ask these questions. Don't accept narrow project boundaries, right? Document cumulative burden, even when terms of reference don't require it, right? Think in systems. Always seek opportunities to deploy participatory methods, to identify those impacts with the community that are not going to show up in an air quality model, right? Make visible what regulatory processes systematically ignore. Use science for advocacy, right? Connect individual projects to broader patterns. Show how this project fits into a larger geography of burden and benefit, okay? Document who gets burdened and who profits. Look at that power analysis, right? Build relationships with the communities experiencing these cumulative impacts, right? Again, your technical skills matter, but many times community relationships matter more. And community expertise is going to really help you the most. The best research emerges from these genuine collaborations, right? Challenge that project by project framework in your work, okay? Single impacts, they do matter. We shouldn't ignore them, but cumulative impacts are going to define whether places remain livable in the future we see ahead, right? Whether people can stay in their homes, whether children can play outside, whether folks can breathe, okay? So I want to leave you again with some questions. So next time someone tells you that an impact is insignificant, ask them insignificant compared to what? Insignificant for whom? Insignificant when you add it to anything else people are already dealing with. What are people already dealing with? We should think about that, right? Because those three questions can change everything. They shift from project focused assessment to cumulative reality, right? From technical compliance to justice. And you now have the conceptual tools, and you will have even more when you finish this course, to see externalities as cumulative impacts everywhere, right? In your neighborhoods, in case studies you read, in your project evaluations, right? Once you see this framework, you can't unsee it. Okay. So use that site responsibly, right? Use it to make visible what gets ignored. Use it to censor the voices of people experiencing cumulative harm. Use it to build better assessment methods and better policy, right? That's cumulative impact assessment. I'll see you in the next lecture.